Well, hello, hello, hello. You are listening to the No Brainers Empowering Possibilities show. These are invitations to ahas, a little bit of science, a dash of behavioral psychology, some easy skills that you can try right now, even today, and a whole lot of creative fun. So if leveling up is on your radar, my friend, you are at the right show. I'm your host, Roseanne Marsh. I'm the author of the teen and the parent empowerment curriculum called Level Up, Empowering Possibilities. And you are listening to episode number 46, Discovering Your Bias. Now, years ago, I was walking my dogs down in a ravine not too far from here. And as we went off the main road down into kind of this wilderness, deserty area, off to the side, I saw 6 black crows. And they were cawing and so loud. And I looked at them and I said, I just knew you'd be here to ruin my walk. That isn't even typical for me to even say something like that, especially to crows that I didn't think would understand me. But all of a sudden they took flight and they started flying above my head. I was like, what in the world is happening? And I thought for sure they must be feeding on the bugs above my head. So I thought, well, I'll just keep walking. So I started walking deeper and deeper down into the ravine away from the main road. And they followed me. Oh my gosh. And then they got getting closer to my head. And I really felt like I was in the Alfred Hitchcock movie of The Birds. And I was soon going to get my eyes pecked out. It was crazy. I was physically shaken. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to get out of here. Well, I got home and I had said to a friend that was staying with me, I told her the experience of the crows dive bombing me and as if they were after me after I had made that remark. And she started to laugh and she said, do you even know what crows symbolize? Just go ahead and look it up. So I did. And I looked at the significance and it said, crows are a symbol of intelligence, mystery, adaptability, and higher perspective. But this last part is what I really paid attention to. The crow is reminding you today to check your prejudice and your bias and where is it showing up in your life. And I thought, whoa, well, I judged the crows. The moment I got down there, it was like, oh, sure, now you're here, you're going to ruin my walk. But isn't that interesting that an animal really put onto my radar a question about, could I be biased? And I didn't even know it. Well, it was interesting because the next 2 weeks, I had several meetings and encounters with physicians and business owners and locksmiths and even a service project with delightful people that came from one particular country that's not my nationality. They were all from there. And then I ran into some neighbors and they were just about to leave for that country. And I was asking during this, because of that crow's visit, is this where my bias is? It doesn't feel like it. But we will learn more about bias. We learned that it's either conscious or it's subconscious. And there's a lot that we may not even know has been patterned into our heads. So interesting that when I pondered the subject on these podcasts, the last 2 have had to do with how we view the world. Number 44 was on changing your lens, changing your perspective on life. But number 45 was on sharpening the focus of our lens for creation. And I think this one truly is one of those filters that we have on our lens that distorts our ability to see reality and to see the perspective from 2 different sides. Our biases are really impinging on our ability to see. So what is a bias? Interesting enough, as I started to deep dive into it, there's over 175 different types of biases, and probably more are being added every single day. But a bias is a tendency to prefer one person or thing to another, and then to favor that person or their thing. So it could be just a personal judgment, but it can be an unreasonable judgment. It can be a prejudice. So where do we get our bias? It's all a product of our life experience. Those things that we have seen, heard, taste, touched, felt, and those books that we've read, the TV shows we watched, the biases of our culture, the stereotypes that are shown to us, the internet, the social media feeds, the podcasts, the news, the jokes we listen to, the music we listen to. It all has a way of being recorded within our neural system. And there it forms patterns of belief. Just answer these questions. Like right now, how do you feel about people who voted for the other political candidate? How do you feel about people who own handguns? How do you feel about people who have a large amount of children, or people who have no children at all? What about those who love animals? And these are just teasers for the stronger topics that are circulating today, but our bias, our opinion, our preference, our prejudice is because of our life experiences, what we have been exposed to in our societies. So I want to address conscious bias and unconscious bias. And we're not talking about the innocuous bias, such as, well, I prefer milk chocolate over dark chocolate, but I'm talking about the biases that infringe on our ability to make good decisions, have fairness reign in our life, and really make sure that we have a broader perspective other than the little microcosm that we're in. Conscious bias. Now, that's a type of bias that we are aware of. We know that it's happening. We're very conscious that that is the bias that we have. And a person with a conscious bias has pretty firm beliefs about something and attitudes, and they're very clear about how they believe. A conscious bias that's extreme is usually characterized by bad behavior, mistreatment, verbal abuse, verbal harassment. It can also be to the point of excluding people. So conscious biases are prejudices. And we've learned about prejudice and those biases all throughout history, through many different nationalities and races and situations. And that usually leads to discrimination against people or groups of people. There's usually malicious intent involved. So that's the conscious bias. You might be thinking, oh, wow, I don't really know that I have a conscious bias. So maybe this is where you fall in. And it's where we all fall in. And that's the unconscious bias. And that's very different than the conscious bias for several reasons. The unconscious bias are beliefs and attitudes that operate without our awareness. They are a direct contrast from our beliefs and values that we think we hold, yet they're down deep inside of our subconscious. They're kind of like difficult to understand. And usually it's not until we're confronted or up against something that, we get a reaction to something and we go, whoa, why did I feel that way? And that doesn't feel comfortable to me. So bias, it's a natural part of the brain, and it's actually useful in many situations. And the trick is to recognize when it's useful and when it's not, because you can have helpful biases, but you can also have those that undermine your ability to really perform at a high level. So how does this happen? The subconscious goes down in and looks at all the patterns of how we respond to things or experiences that we've had. Now, remember, it takes a lot of energy for the subconscious to be constantly collecting and getting all the data ready for us. And a lot of times it just likes to save energy. And to save the energy, it just looks for patterns, the large patterns, and then kind of gives us, okay, here are the cliff notes on what I was able to find for you. And it may be very different from what you think your values are, or we think our attitudes are. But because of the patterns of what we've been exposed to and experienced in our life, the subconscious is retrieving some things that are then driving how we behave. It has to conserve energy because there is just too much information that's coming in. And if the brain had to literally dissect and rethink about everything, imagine if you had to rethink, okay, now how do I open a door? Okay, let's go in and retrieve that. Or how do I turn a key? Or how do I say hello to somebody? The brain looks for patterns and quickly gives a response. Now, the downside to that is it sees pattern in everything that you've experienced in life. So that means the whole thing is happening in the back of our heads, and we don't even know it's happening. So this can cause us to behave in ways that are not true to who we really want to or feel we are. We might not even know it, but we are drawn to what feels normal, not necessarily what's right, but we're drawn to that which feels normal and familiar. And sometimes something that's different feels dangerous to us. It feels wrong. It's not necessarily that it's wrong. It's just not a part of our norm. You can be in a discussion with someone and you can be debating or conversing about something, and you can give them 10 pieces of information about why what they're saying is maybe not accurate. And the brain switches off because it feels uncomfortable. And when the brain starts interpreting that, it's like, oh, nope, that doesn't fit in with the patterns that we already have. It's incredible, isn't it? So even if we are wanting to learn new things, the brain is in the subconscious rejecting all those things. They were using MRI machines to take pictures of the brain action, and they put people on these electrodes. And then they took pictures after they showed them different pictures of different people. And the brain would light up in different areas, and they could see the reaction. So maybe one person would maybe had a bad reaction to young adolescent males. Another one maybe didn't like green eyes or brown eyes. So it's interesting that when the brain could just be analyzed by what was being put in front of them, the biases or the triggers that came up subconsciously for these people. Fascinating, isn't it? So if we're human, we have unconscious biases, and we get them from our upbringing, from the media, from the education. So if you're someone who hires someone, your subconscious is already throwing out a lot of information, like you're looking at how the resume was written, how do they look, their age, their gender, their race, their background. So while you're trying to stay objective, your subconscious is feeding you feelings, opinions, and beliefs about the patterns that you have inside of you, your biases. And the one who's being interviewed has the same thing happening to them. So I want you to imagine this visual. If you take a piece of paper and if you pierce it with a pencil and make a hole, I want you to put your eye up to the hole and view the world. And this pinhole example represents what our brain is doing to us at a subconscious level. So to save energy is looking for those broader patterns and narrowing it down to eliminate it to just a little sampling of what you've experienced. And honestly, there's a safety factor in that, right? It conserves the energy of the brain, but more importantly, sometimes when life is simpler, it's easier for us and it's more manageable than having all these complex things that we're having to think of and evaluate and dissect. But it does impede our ability to see. It does impede our ability to see, and therefore to expand our perspective and our learning. And we can't see what we don't see. Oh my goodness. Have you asked a teenager to go to the fridge and get out the mayonnaise? And they go there and they open up the fridge and they close the door and they come back and they go, I can't find it. And then you go with them to the fridge, open it up, and there it is, chest high, right in front of them. But we have a hard time seeing what we have not seen before. We have a hard time believing what we haven't believed before. I had an instance that just happened the other day. It was really interesting. I was in a meeting with an international group of people. And we've had many different meetings. And I've been in a view meeting with one of the gals on the team who didn't show her video. It just showed her name there. And of course, she was engaged and used her audio. But I was new enough to the group that I didn't want to say, hey, can you turn your video on so we can see your face? So the other day, it was just a one-on-one with the two of us. And she got on and she didn't put her visual on. And she lives in a different time zone than I do. She's probably 7 or 8 hours ahead of me. And I'm thinking to myself, that would make it this time in her time zone. Maybe she didn't get ready, or maybe she rolled out of bed. But I was judging the lack of professionalism she had by an assumption that I had made. She was talking from another part of the world from me. And she told me that her government was told 25 years ago that there was not enough electricity for the country, and they needed to redo all the power systems, and it would take 40 years to complete. Now you think, oh, they only have 15 more years and they're going to have an infrastructure. No, the government never started the project. And because of that, there's mandatory power outages depending on the stage they're on. And she said they're for 2.5 hours at a time, sometimes 3 to 4 times a day. So she was saving her electricity by not putting the video on, literally living with sporadic electricity, doing business over the internet. She has a router and she keeps the batteries charged, and then she keeps her video off to save electricity. Oh my gosh. I had to check fast my judgment that came from that subconscious. But then we had an amazing conversation about lifestyle, societal challenges. We found common ground in some things. And I left that conversation feeling like I had this bigger hole that I had just made in my paper. And oh, how grateful I am for electricity now that I take for granted every day. I mean, I made a decision. When I feel my bias and judgment coming up, I'm now going to ask myself to look for the story instead of thinking I know. I'm going to look for the story instead of thinking that I know, based on that tiny little microcosm of life experience that I have. So we all have biases and we act on them. This doesn't make us bad people. I just want to clarify. It doesn't make us bad people. Some of the conscious biases we really have to watch. But our goal is to make the unconscious more conscious. And there's a difference between holding a bias and acting out on that bias. There's even another couple biases that I want to talk about, because we're not going to talk about 175, but these are the ones I felt were very applicable to right now. And one is a community bias, that if I'm a part of a community, it's hard to accept an idea that would get me kicked out of that community, because I value being a part of it and I want to be a part of it. And if I value belonging to a community, then I will find it easy to accept the values of that community. It's interesting, isn't it? So we tend to favor those that are part of our group, and we could possibly exclude people who are not a part of a particular group. So birds of a feather are good and comfortable, and they serve a purpose, right? But with expansion comes learning about our biases. Then we can consciously work on it, we can catch it, and we can get curious about it. So that is the community bias, but there's also a confirmation bias. And that's where we tend to listen more to the information that confirms the beliefs that we already have. Through this bias, we try to find those sources that confirm what we think. Now think about that. We're in a really precarious time when the algorithm tracks what we search for. And then it has a tendency to feed us continually those things. So if someone else thinks a different way, then they're going to get fed a lot of information. And we both are looking for information, and we're both saying, oh my gosh, I've got proof here and I've got proof here. And we both think we're right. but it's because of this information. So there's different ways of getting information other than just the internet, right? Again, it's about conserving energy. When we start getting information that's counter to what we have in our subconscious, the brain kind of shuts down and doesn't even listen. And we can't see what we haven't seen. So if you have a confirmation bias, it means that maybe you're only paying attention to information that confirms your certain beliefs that you have on different subjects or topics, etc. Or you're only following people on social media who share your same point of view, and you're choosing news sources that support your views. And if you're refusing to listen to the opposing side and don't want to consider all the facts, there's a few reasons why this happens. Again, it helps limit the mental resources that we have to go through. And it helps us protect our self-esteem by making people feel like our beliefs are accurate. It helps my self-esteem, like, oh yeah, I feel good about this because it's being confirmed. But two people on two different sides of an issue can listen to the same story and walk away with a different interpretation. So they can feel like they've got their points validated because they will extricate from it what feels familiar, what the subconscious is bringing in. I think it's about 100 million bytes of information that are being fed to our brain constantly, but the conscious brain can only handle 40 bytes. So there's a lot of information that's just going into the subconscious, and it's just categorizing it as it will. It's also a reason to be careful about what we expose ourselves to, right? So how can we work on our bias? With all this, we're trying to override that programmed patterns in the brain and allow us to expand our version, expand our vision, our understanding, our perspective. And it walks us in places that are so uncomfortable because it just isn't our norm. It's not our reality, or we've never experienced. And we don't see it in our pinhole of understanding. So when we're serious about removing that filter or enlarging that hole in the paper, we need to move from feeling threatened and uncomfortable to becoming more curious. I just love Nancy Drew, always have. I feel like she needs to be my second name. But when we get super curious, it doesn't mean that we get converted to everything that we learn about, but there's like an expansion of understanding when we can get into somebody else's perspective. So here's a couple of tools that I'm learning to put in my tool belt to help discover my biases. Because after all, the crows have invited me to look at where is it showing up in my life. Here's tool number one, and this is an interesting one. We need to take time when we make decisions and judgments. I made a snap judgment the other day on that gal that didn't show her face on the video, but those patterns come up so fast because the brain is conserving energies like, okay, here's your answer. Here it is. So it gives a broad view judgment to what you're experiencing is conserving energy. We have to kick our brain in when we want some critical thinking. And here's the really cool part about this tool. If we've been working all day and we are hungry, it takes away from the efficacy of the brain. Have you ever heard in third world countries, you don't go in and teach them things until you have fed them? When the body gets what it needs, then the brain can be more efficient. So the best time to make decisions is a couple hours after you've eaten, when the body needs are taken care of. Isn't that interesting? So that's tool number one. And I'm all about eating, right? The second tool is we can do a comparison mentally. And sometimes this can be really eye-opening. We can also call it substitution. So whenever we're confronted with something or someone, we can imagine, I'm going to substitute another person in there. So if I'm in there and I'm talking to a banker, what if I visualize that as a different gender, a different nationality, whatever? And would I feel the same way? This is kind of my check and balance. Would I still respond the same way that I just did? Or would I still have these viewpoints that I have if I substituted that person with a different person? So that's a good way for us to check. The third tool is to look at 2 or 3 people in your workplace or outside the workplace who you would go to if you had an issue to discuss, who would those people be? And if you line them up, if you had them around a table, what would be their education, their gender, their age, their sexuality, their ethnicity, and on? Who would be on your unofficial advisory board? And do they look a lot like you? We can challenge ourselves to seek out the perspective of someone different from ourselves, like finding ways to interact, even in a line waiting somewhere or at an airport. We can seek out that interaction. Remember, we reject what is uncomfortable or unfamiliar for us. In my young adult years, I would hang out with a group that on Sundays we would go and get special need young adults that were in wheelchairs and take them up the canyon and do fun things. And I remember the first couple of times it was just so foreign to me. I didn't know how to interact, what to say, what to do. And I found out they're so much like me. They're funny, they're sharp, they love being out. And thankfully, those other young adults had figured out long ago what service looked like, but we got more out of it than I think they did. But it became comfortable for me, where before it was foreign, and I felt inadequate, to be honest. So that third tool of looking at who you surround yourself with is really about having experiences. So it's not making snap judgments, making sure you're fed so your brain can be effective, then substituting that person in front of you, and then having life experiences, getting out there and getting to know other people and having those experiences that maybe are a bias that you've identified. And this last one is continue that education, educate ourselves. It could be try to follow other social media accounts that maybe have a converse idea to what we are following. Maybe it's reading books, both fiction and nonfiction, and maybe talking to friends and family who may know more than we do. When I look at my circle of associations, whether it's my best friends, my circle of influence, or my organizations I belong to, how different are they from me? And what if I'm missing an opportunity to see the world very differently? So bias is something that is hardwired in the brain. None of us escapes it, but with awareness, curiosity, experience, love, and a little tolerance, we begin to see what we did not see before. So my invitation this week is to look at your biases. We only covered a few of them, but what is your conscious bias? What are ones like, oh yeah, I feel like this? And is there something that you can learn about that? What are your unconscious biases? What comes up? Where do you get triggered? What is your communal bias? And what is your confirmation bias, where you are looking for information to make sure and solidify that what you believe is 100% true? When we are willing to widen the scope of view, we enhance our life and bring an empowerment that only comes from being able to see what we didn't see before. Tally ho, my friends.